welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. This week, our subject is Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon was born near Madrid in the early hours of the 16th of December, 1485, 4 months after the Battle of Bosworth, when the House of Tudor overthrew the House of York in England. She was the youngest surviving child of King Fernando II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile. She lived on the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula is the peninsula on the south side of France, separated from northern Africa by the Strait of Gibraltar. Today, the Iberian Peninsula consists of Spain and Portugal. In the late 15th century, Portugal still kind of looks like Portugal looks now. They've been consistent. But what we call Spain was many smaller kingdoms. Catherine's father was the King of Aragon. Catherine's mother was the Queen of Castile, Leon, and Galicia. Navarre, a small kingdom bordering Castile and Aragon and France, was for now its own country. All of these countries were Catholic and following the Pope in Europe. In the south was the Kingdom of Granada. Granada was in a tough position. They were the only Muslim country in the Iberian Peninsula and the gateway to northern Africa. Granada had been Muslim for 800 years. They were well established and the fighting ground between the European Catholics and the Muslims of North Africa. The marriage of Catherine's parents united a large portion of what we now know as Spain. Uniting all of their kingdoms together left only Portugal, Navarre, and Granada on the outside of the Iberian Peninsula unification. Isabella was queen of 4 countries now instead of just 3, and she wanted the entire peninsula. Her main goal right now being Granada. Isabella was a devout Catholic, and she believed that she needed to take Granada for God. They started fighting for Granada 3 years before Catherine's birth, and didn't win the war until she was 7 years old. Catherine was born during a war that both her parents were on the battlefield for. She was kept off the front lines, but there were many stories of governesses and knights having to rush the royal children away because they were at war, and sometimes the borders changed quickly and unexpectedly. Her parents took on the Alexander the Great way of conquering. When they conquered an area, they dressed as people in the local area dressed, ate the food that the local people ate, and behaved according to local customs. They had one non-negotiable, though. You had to be Catholic. Whether it was a Jewish or a Muslim region, that was the deal. You can keep your way of life, just not your chosen religion. Obviously, this didn't go over well with anyone who didn't want to be Catholic. And the North Africans had been ruling Granada for the last 800 years, so it was culturally much more North African than Spanish. Because of this, Catherine grew up in an extremely diverse court in everything except religion. She was, for the time, a very well-traveled and open-minded princess. Catherine was quite short in stature, with long red hair, wide blue eyes, a round face, and a fair complexion. In her youth, Catherine was described as the most beautiful creature in the world. In 1492, Isabella and Fernando won the war against the Muslims of Granada. Now that war was over, it was time for conversions, forced conversions. The Spanish Inquisition told Spanish Jews and Granada Muslims to convert or get out. For the people that refused, there was torture or forced conversion or execution. And it wasn't just that they had the backing of Rome. Militarily, they were stronger than Rome. When Rome was warring with the Turks, it was Isabella and Fernando that they asked for help from. This doesn't sound right by today's standards, but at the time it was considered progressive to not just kill them. Giving them the option to convert was seen as very forward-thinking for the time. It was also considered progressive that skin color had nothing to do with it. It was religion and only religion. If you convincingly converted, you were accepted. But in any case, it wasn't much of a choice. You had to do it. The same year they conquered Granada, Isabella and Fernando decided to become patrons of Christopher Columbus, who wanted to see what else was out there to conquer. And not long after that, Hernán Cortés was sent out from Spain. So, spoiler alert, North and South America, that was what was next for them. Conquering was their favorite thing other than Catholicism. Depending on if you ask the Catholics or the Muslims, Jews, and native North and South Americans, they were either very, very famous or very, very infamous. But they were the power couple of the late 15th century and the Pope's favorite monarchs. Hashtag teachers' pets. The royal family made their home in Granada at the Alhambra Palace and Fortress Complex. It was 250 years old and an amazing example of Islamic architecture in what is now southern Spain. Princess Catherine, or Infanta Catalina, as she was known, was the youngest child of the Spanish royal family. From the age of 7, she was raised primarily in Granada. The temperature was warm, but not too hot. The water was clean, and tropical fruits could grow there. Catherine was educated in arithmetic, both canon and civil law, meaning religious and secular law, classical literature, genealogy and heraldry, history, philosophy, religion, and theology. She had a strong religious upbringing and developed her Roman Catholic faith that would play a major role in her later life. She learned to speak, read, and write Castilian Spanish and Latin, and spoke French and Greek. Erasmus later said that Catherine loved good literature, which she had studied with success since childhood. Catherine was a little girl who loved to read. Hashtag relatable. She had been given lessons in domestic skills, such as cooking, embroidery, lace making, needlepoint, sewing, spinning, and weaving, and was also taught music, dancing, drawing, as well as being carefully educated in good manners and court etiquette. What I'm saying is that she was raised from birth to be a powerful queen consort. She was shaping up to be another near-perfect queen like we haven't seen since Queen Philippa. But her future husband was no Edward III. At an early age, Catherine was considered a suitable wife for Arthur, Prince of Wales, the heir to the English throne. Due to the English ancestry she had inherited from her mother, she was descended on her maternal side from the House of Lancaster, an English royal house. Her great-grandmother was Constance of Castile, who married John of Gaunt. That episode is a blast from the past. You can go check it out. Her great-great-great-grandmother was Blanche of Lancaster, who was also married to John of Gaunt, making her both the great-great-granddaughter and the great-great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, which, if you are confused, makes her her own third cousin once removed. It really was a family affair. Her great-great-grandmother, Constance of Castile, had one child with her English husband. He was busy with his mistress. That one child was named Catherine, and she returned to Castile to be queen. Queen Catherine, her great-great-grandmother, half Castilian, half English, is who she was named after. Because being related to them was something men used to really look for in a bride. Theoretically, by means of her mother, Catherine had a stronger legitimate claim to the English throne than King Henry VII himself. Through the first two wives of John of Gaunt, 1st Duke of Lancaster, Blanche of Lancaster, and Constance of Castile. In contrast, Henry VII was the descendant of John of Gaunt's third marriage to Catherine Swynford, the mistress who Catherine's great-great-grandfather had been preoccupied with. Their children were born out of wedlock and only legitimized retroactively after the death of Constance and the marriage of John to Catherine. The children of John and Catherine, while legitimized, were barred from inheriting the English throne, something that was ignored in later generations because of Henry's descent through illegitimate children barred from succession to the English throne. Sometimes getting the throne comes from inheriting it, and sometimes it's popular opinion or through combat. Some of the people were over the government and looking for someone new, and that's what the Tudors were. They had a big army and public support. The Tudor monarchy, though, was not accepted by all European kingdoms. They had taken the throne by force, so it could be taken from them by force. So the alliance of Catherine and Arthur validated the House of Tudor in the eyes of the European royalty and strengthened the Tudor claim to the English throne via Catherine of Aragon's ancestry. It would have given a male heir an indisputable claim to the throne. They had drawn in the Yorkists with Elizabeth of York, and they were attempting to draw in the Lancastrians with Catherine. The Tudors were politicians. The two were married by proxy on the 19th of May, 1499, at the ages of 13 and 12. And they corresponded in Latin until Arthur turned 15 3 years later, when it was decided that they were old enough to begin their conjugal life. Not only did Catherine converse with her future husband in Latin, but also with his mother and grandmother. Arthur wrote about how excited he was to start their life together. Her future mother-in-law and grandmother-in-law attempted to give her advice to make her transition to England more comfortable. Some of the advice included, make sure to pay attention to French lessons, because most of the English ladies don't speak Latin or Spanish. They didn't suggest she learn English, because at that time that was only a language really utilized in England. French was much more useful, both in England and in Greater Europe. Another piece of advice was to learn to enjoy wine, because the water in England wasn't drinkable. It would make you sick. The land that would eventually be united into Spain was warm, had drinkable water, and was lush with fruits and vegetables. England was dark and cold and didn't have water to drink that wouldn't make you sick and potentially kill you. And also, do you want to have a garden? Probably not going to work, especially in the cities. The water was so bad and the soil was so bad. Anything you grew wouldn't be edible, and certainly not the things she was used to from Granada. This was a very different environment. Infanta Catalina was not used to it. England needed Catherine more than Catherine needed England. But she was raised for this. It was her duty, and she was going to fake it till she made it, because England needed her more than she needed them. And her parents likely used their leverage to give their daughter a softer landing. There were two men imprisoned in the Tower of London, one claiming to be the younger brother of the Queen, and one who was the cousin of that same Queen. Both men could have been figureheads for the former royal family to rise up and depose the current royal family. Coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, those men tried to escape and were executed. So, no more threat? The timing is sus. But that paved the way for Catherine to go to England. Starting in Granada, the southern tip of Spain, she traveled north, through Spain, and then up into Greater Europe. The journey was long, from May to October. It took 5 months to get across Europe, and they still had to make it to the island. She traveled from southern Spain to Plymouth, England. The journey was tough, and they were almost shipwrecked in the English Channel. It took an additional month to get to England than anticipated. She was likely tired from her long journey. Keep in mind, she grew up in sunny southern Spain, and she had left in May. Now it was November, in England, probably dark and somewhat rainy. It wasn't the atmosphere she was used to at all. She was a 16-year-old girl trying to not look concerned by her new surroundings. England was seen to be starting its Renaissance, but it would have looked very medieval to the Infanta Catalina. Catherine brought a group of her African attendants with her, including one identified as the trumpeter, John Blank. They are the first recorded Africans to have arrived in London at that time, and they were considered luxury servants. They were paid and treated well on the condition that they were Catholic. They had to be very, very, very Catholic. And they caused a great impression about the princess and the power of her family. A number of English gentlewomen were appointed to be ready to welcome her upon arrival. They were to escort Catherine on a flotilla of barges on the Thames to the Tower of London. Catherine was then escorted through London by her future brother-in-law, Prince Harry. Harry was 10 years old. This would have been exciting to 10-year-old Harry. Something to note, because if you listen to all 6 wives of Henry VIII, there are some similarities between this arrival of Catherine and the planned arrival of his 4th wife, Anne of Cleves. My theory is this is what he was attempting to recreate with his next foreign wife. For now, he was his brother's spare, but he was being trained to be a man of God. The hope was that someday he would be a pope. If he was pope and his brother was king, England couldn't lose. They would be considered legitimate all throughout Europe. Little is known about the first impressions of each other, but Arthur did write to his parents-in-law that he would be a true and loving husband, and told his parents that he was immensely happy to behold the face of his lovely bride. The couple had corresponded in Latin, but they found out that they couldn't understand each other's spoken conversation because they had learned different Latin pronunciations. They weren't fluent enough to understand each other's heavy accents. That had occurred to exactly no one. So it was a bit of a bump in the road that they couldn't actually speak to each other. 10 days later, on the 14th of November, 1501, they were married. Queen Isabella said, "Don't waste your money on a huge wedding." It was her youngest daughter. They were close, but this alliance was not one Spain needed at this point. But King Henry was like, "Are you kidding me? I'm relying on this being a big effing deal." It was quite the extravagant affair. A dowry of 200,000 ducats had been agreed on, and half was paid shortly after the marriage. It was noted that Catherine and her Spanish ladies in waiting were dressed in Spanish style at her arrival and at the wedding. She was representing Spain for her parents. She was the third cousin of her father-in-law, Henry VII of England, and the fourth cousin of her mother-in-law, Queen Elizabeth, making her both the third and fourth cousin once removed to her husband, Arthur. Awkward. Once married, Arthur was sent to Ludlow Castle on the borders of Wales to preside over the Council of Wales and the Marches. As was his duty as the Prince of Wales, it was like king training. He was practicing in Wales to become king of the whole country. His bride followed him shortly after. Wales was an easy place for Arthur to live, but not for Catherine to live. She was described after her wedding as pensive and annoyed. Wales was dark and cold and came with a 15-year-old husband who she couldn't talk to. A few months later, they both became ill, possibly with the sweating sickness that was sweeping the area. In a twist of fate, the sweating sickness had been brought to England when Arthur's father, King Henry, had come over from France to take the throne. Arthur died of sweating sickness on the 2nd of April, 1502, at the age of 15. 16-year-old Catherine recovered to find herself a widow. She had spent 3 years getting to know this boy through letters and a nearly 6-month dangerous journey to get to England, only to be made a widow 4 months into her marriage. That's it, 4 months, and it was over. At this point, Henry VII faced the challenge of avoiding the obligation to return her 200,000 ducat dowry, half of which he had not yet even received. He didn't want to return it to Catherine's father. And that's what was required by the marriage contract if they sent her home. If they sent her home, she had to come with the money. This changed things for more than just Catherine. Without Arthur, Prince Harry was his father's heir at 11. It was time to change his major from religious studies to poli-sci. He was going to be the next king. Catherine's in-laws were heartbroken at the loss of their son Arthur, at the hands of a sickness that his father's army had brought to England when they invaded. They couldn't replace him, but they were nervous to only have one surviving son. They didn't think the English people would accept the Tudor queen. They went back to making babies. Queen Elizabeth has her own episode, Elizabeth of York. She was a model queen, kind, sweet, usually pregnant. But she was now 36 years old, so she had probably thought her baby-making days were over, or nearing the end at least. She had survived giving birth 6 times. She had lost 2 of those babies. At 36, she became pregnant with her 7th child. Less than a year after Arthur died, Queen Elizabeth had her 7th baby, a little girl named Princess Catherine. Queen Elizabeth developed an infection and passed away 9 days after having her baby, on her 37th birthday. Her baby Catherine also died that same week. Following the death of Queen Elizabeth in February 1503, King Henry VII initially considered marrying Catherine to himself. But the opposition of her father and potential questions over the legitimacy of any children the couple may have ended that idea. Even in the 16th century, it was frowned upon to marry your son's widow. By church law, she was considered the daughter of the king. To settle the matter, it was agreed that Catherine would marry Henry VII's second son, Henry, Duke of York, who was 5 years younger than she was. The plan was for them to marry when Harry was 15 and the Dowager Princess Catherine was 20. The death of Catherine's mother, however, meant that her value in the marriage market had decreased. Ew. The problem originated here. Catherine was a princess times 4. Her father was the King of Aragon, and her mother was the Queen of Castile, Leon, and Galicia. Castile and Company was much larger than Aragon, and it was inherited by Catherine's elder sister Juana. Ostensibly, the marriage was delayed until Henry was old enough, but Fernando II procrastinated so much over the payment of the remainder of her dowry that it became doubtful that the marriage would ever take place. He still owed the Tudors 100,000 ducats, and he didn't want to pay it. He didn't have as much money anymore. He was now back to being only the king of one country. And she was no longer a princess times 4. She was a princess times 1 and a former princess times 3. She lived as a virtual prisoner in London. King Henry kept Catherine away from court and her supposed future husband, treating her slowly worse and worse and worse. She had to sell off some of her personal belongings to pay for her household. Some of the letters she wrote to her father, complaining of her treatment, have survived. In one of these letters, she tells him, "I choose what I believe, and I say nothing, for I am not as simple as I may seem." She had little money and struggled to cope, as she had to support not just herself, but also her ladies-in-waiting. She had a household, and that household cost money that she wasn't being provided with. In 1507, her father appointed her the Spanish ambassador to England. That way he could pay her as the ambassador, and she had some say in what was going down with her marriage. She was the first female ambassador in European history. While Henry VII and his counselors expected her to be easily manipulated, Catherine went on to prove them wrong again and again. Catherine was no doormat. Marriage to Arthur's brother depended on the Pope granting dispensation because canon law forbade a man to marry his brother's widow under Leviticus 18:16. "Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy brother's wife. It is thy brother's nakedness." Catherine testified that her marriage to Arthur was never consummated. According to canon law, the marriage could be undone unless it was consummated. The fact that they had a wedding didn't make them married. Whether or not they had sex did. And she had been highly educated in canon law. She knew what would and wouldn't count. If you listen to the episode where I spoke about Joan of Arc, you may be wondering why they didn't do an exam to check if she was still a virgin. Gross, but that's what they did with Joan. It's because Catherine was royal, and they couldn't just check without her permission. Joan of Arc had been a French peasant girl, so she had less rights. She didn't need to give consent. Was Catherine and Arthur's marriage consummated? I have no idea. I go back and forth. Right now, I think probably. These were two teenagers who had been writing letters to each other in Latin to get to know each other for 3 years. They were married in front of the English court and God, and they were not only encouraged to have sex, it was a requirement and their main duty. They would have had to at least tried, I assume. But also, they couldn't speak together. They wrote in Latin because they could both read and speak Latin, but with their different pronunciations, they couldn't understand each other's spoken word. She spoke Spanish and he spoke English. Their Latin, though the same, sounded very, very different. They hadn't realized that they wouldn't be able to speak together. They also had 4 months together to practice talking and write little notes back and forth. I remember in high school, I may have written my boyfriends more notes than spoken words. When we were together, we weren't really talking. We were usually kissing. So I tend to lean toward they consummated their marriage, even if it was only for duty. But Catherine wasn't acting like a teenager in love. She seemed miserable, so maybe not. Arthur had been running around the castle, flexing about how tired he was from being in the midst of Spain. His words, not mine. Catherine had been telling her ladies that nothing had been happening, that it was all talk and very disappointing. But also, it doesn't really matter. It did matter to them back then. She had to testify about it because they thought it mattered a great deal. What does matter is that 17-year-old Catherine testified that she was still a virgin, and the court agreed with her. The king, her father-in-law, agreed. The church court agreed. Everyone agreed and breathed a sigh of relief because that moved one complication out of the way. The Pope even stipulated that if the marriage had been consummated, God was cool with that too. No one knew it yet, but this was the first seed of England leaving the Catholic Church, but not for another 2 decades. Catherine's father, Fernando, didn't want to send the rest of the dowry. He wanted his daughter returned. So King Henry wouldn't allow the marriage to happen when Prince Harry turned 15. It still didn't happen the following year when Prince Harry turned 16 and Princess Catherine was 21, or the next year when they were 17 and 22. They were just waiting for their fathers to come to an agreement. But this whole time, Catherine just had to wait in England in political purgatory. But then something changed. King Henry died of tuberculosis at the age of 52. The king is dead. Long live the king. Prince Harry was now the 17-year-old King Henry VIII. 17 is maybe not the prime age to become king. Both of his parents were deceased, and he relied a great deal on his grandmother, Margaret Beaufort, who has her own episode if you need a refresher. She told him what to do and what to not do. She helped him plan everything, and they did not waste any time. King Henry died on April 21st. He was buried 20 days later on May 11th. The new King Henry VIII was then married to Catherine exactly 1 month later on June 11th. 13 days after the wedding was the coronation of King Henry VIII and Queen Catherine on June 24, 1509, a midsummer's day. In just over 60 days, Prince Harry had gone from a single teenage prince to a married teenage king. The king's grandmother, Margaret Beaufort, helped him arrange all of these last-minute plans. In the 2 months after her only son's death, she was 66, and sometime around her grandson's coronation, she got sick. 4 days after his coronation, King Henry turned 18, and the very next day, his grandmother, Margaret Beaufort, died of the illness she'd picked up around the coronation. In the 8 years since he was 10, King Henry had lost his brother, making him the heir, and then his mother, and then his father, making him the king, and then his grandmother. He had a very stressful adolescence, and he was now an 18-year-old king with no familial role models left. And his wife, the now 23-year-old Queen Catherine, had been there for all of it. In the month that followed, many social occasions presented the new queen to the English public. She made a fine impression and was well received by the people of England. She was popular. They liked her. Catherine and Henry were still young, but by Renaissance standards, they were getting a late start at 18 and 23. And they had learned from Catherine's first marriage to Henry's brother that they may not have a lot of time. So they went to work starting a family right away. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com or on Facebook or Instagram at Long Live the Queen Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, you can support it by buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/longlivethequeen. Long live to all the queens out there, and until next week, bye.